He doesn't belong in the Blackwood family portrait." Those were the exact words my mother-in-law, Eleanor Blackwood, said as she looked directly at my 8-year-old son, Jasper, who was standing right beside me in the grand foyer of the Blackwood estate in Millbrook Heights. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. The coldness behind those words cut through the warm autumn air like a blade through silk. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The entire Blackwood clan had gathered for their annual family reunion and portrait session, a tradition that had been going on for 43 years, ever since Eleanor's late husband built this sprawling estate overlooking Lake Serenity. Cousins, aunts, uncles, siblings, and their children filled the marble-floored entryway, all dressed in their coordinated navy and cream outfits, all chattering excitedly about continuing the family legacy in what would be the most important photograph of the year. Everyone except my son. I felt Jasper's small hand slip into mine, his fingers trembling slightly. He was wearing the exact same navy blazer and cream shirt that all the other Blackwood children wore. I had spent weeks coordinating with my sister-in-law, Victoria, to make sure he matched perfectly. I had even driven 2 hours to the specialty children's boutique in Riverside Commons to get the exact shade of navy that Eleanor had specified in her detailed email instructions. But as I looked around that opulent foyer, with its crystal chandelier casting dancing shadows across the family portraits that lined the walls, portraits that documented 4 decades of Blackwood family history, I realized that matching outfits weren't going to be enough. Not for Eleanor. Not for a woman who had spent the last 5 years making it abundantly clear that my son would never truly be part of this family. The professional photographer, a distinguished man in his 60s named Harrison Mills, was already setting up his equipment in the estate's formal living room. His assistant was arranging the antique furniture and adjusting the lighting to capture what Eleanor called the perfect representation of Blackwood heritage. Through the arched doorway, I could see the burgundy velvet chairs and the ornate fireplace mantel where generations of Blackwoods had posed before us. "Mother, perhaps we should discuss this privately," my husband Thomas said quietly, his jaw tightening in that way it did when he was trying to control his temper. But Eleanor held up her hand, silencing him with a gesture that reminded everyone, in that room, exactly who held the power in the Blackwood family. "There's nothing to discuss," Eleanor replied, her steel-gray eyes never leaving Jasper's face. "This portrait will hang in the main hallway alongside all the others. It will be here long after I'm gone, and I won't have it. Complicated by circumstances that don't reflect our true family lineage." The room fell silent. You could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the corner, its steady rhythm marking each uncomfortable second that passed. Victoria's children, Eleanor's biological grandchildren, stood clustered near the staircase, their faces confused but obedient. They had learned, just as their parents had, not to question Eleanor Blackwood when she made a decision. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. This wasn't the first time Eleanor had made her feelings clear about Jasper, but it was the first time she had done it so publicly, in front of the entire extended family. Usually, her exclusions were more subtle, forgetting to include him in holiday card photos, accidentally, not ordering him a gift at family gatherings, or simply looking through him as if he didn't exist. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was her making a statement in front of everyone that mattered to her, drawing a line in the sand that she expected everyone to respect. Jasper looked up at me with those bright green eyes that reminded me so much of his father, his biological father who had died in a car accident when Jasper was only 2 years old, 3 months before I met Thomas. Eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity, eyes that had seen too much heartbreak for someone so young, eyes that trusted me to protect him from exactly this kind of moment. "Mom?" he whispered, so quietly that only I could hear him. "Why doesn't Grandma Eleanor want me in the picture?" I opened my mouth to respond, to find some way to explain the unexplainable, to soften the sharp edges of a woman who had never learned to love beyond her own rigid definitions of family. But before I could speak, something unexpected happened. Jasper let go of my hand. He took a small step forward, closer to Eleanor, and looked up at her with the kind of direct, unblinking gaze that only children possess, the kind that sees straight, through pretense and protocol to the truth underneath. And then he said something that would change everything. Something that would make this entire room of adults realize they had underestimated the wisdom of an 8-year-old boy who had been watching, listening, and understanding far more than any of them had given him credit for. Something that would make Eleanor Blackwood, the iron-willed matriarch who had controlled this family for decades, do something no one in that room thought they would ever witness. What happened next would turn this family reunion into a day that none of them would ever forget, and it would all begin with 7 simple words from a little boy who refused to be invisible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My name is Isabella Martinez Blackwood, and standing in that marble foyer, watching my mother-in-law dismiss my son like he was nothing more than an inconvenience, I felt every carefully built bridge I'd constructed over the past 5 years crumble beneath my feet. When I married Thomas Blackwood 3 years ago in the chapel at Willowbrook Gardens, I thought I was finally giving Jasper the stable family he deserved. Thomas had met us at a community center in downtown Millbrook Heights, where I was volunteering as a reading tutor, and he was there for a charity board meeting. Jasper was 5 then, full of questions about everything and everyone, and Thomas had spent that entire evening patiently answering every single one of them. Why do you wear a tie to work? Do you have a dog? Can you play chess? What's your favorite dinosaur? Most men would have found excuses to escape after the first 10 minutes. Thomas sat on those tiny plastic chairs designed for children and engaged with my son like he was the most fascinating person in the room. By the time we left that night, Jasper was calling him Mr. Thomas and asking when we'd see him again. That was Thomas. Kind, patient, genuine. Everything his mother was not. The Blackwood family had built their fortune in shipping and logistics over 3 generations. Their company, Blackwood Maritime Solutions, controlled most of the cargo operations along the eastern seaboard from their headquarters in Harbor Point. Thomas was being groomed to take over the family business, which meant Eleanor's approval. Wasn't just about family harmony, it was about his entire future. Eleanor had made her position clear from our very first meeting. We were having dinner at the exclusive Riverside Country Club, and she had asked Thomas, not me, if the boy would be a permanent fixture in his life, not Jasper, not my son. The boy. Like he was a stray dog Thomas had picked up and might eventually abandon when the novelty wore off. Jasper is part of Isabella, Thomas had said firmly. If you want me in your life, you accept both of them. Eleanor had smiled tightly, cut her salmon into precise pieces, and changed the subject to the weather. But I knew better than to mistake her silence for acceptance. Over the following months, the subtle exclusions began. Family barbecues where somehow there weren't enough hamburgers prepared. Christmas gifts for all the grandchildren except one. Birthday parties where the invitation got lost in the mail. Each incident was small enough to be explained away as an oversight, but together they formed a clear pattern. Thomas saw it too, but Eleanor was a master at creating plausible deniability. When he confronted her, she would look genuinely surprised and promise to do better next time. But next time never came. The worst part was watching Jasper try to understand it. He was too young to grasp the complexities of adult prejudice, but old enough to notice that he was different from Thomas's biological nieces and nephews. He would ask me why Grandma Eleanor never remembered his favorite cookies, or why she always seemed to forget his name and called him sweetie or dear instead. Maybe she's just getting old, Mom, he'd say with the generous heart of a child, trying to make sense of inexplicable unkindness. I had hoped that today would be different. The annual family portrait was Eleanor's most cherished tradition, and I thought that surely, on such an important family occasion, she would set aside her reservations and include Jasper. I had even spoken to Thomas about it the night before. "She's had 3 years to get used to us being part of the family," I had said as we lay in bed in our home in Maple Ridge, a modest neighborhood about 20 minutes from the Blackwood estate. "This portrait will hang in that hallway forever. Doesn't she want to remember this time when all her family was together?" Thomas had pulled me closer and kissed the top of my head. "She'll come around, Bella. She has to. Jasper's not going anywhere, and neither are you." But standing in that foyer, watching Eleanor's cold eyes dismiss my son with such casual cruelty, I realized that Thomas's optimism had been misplaced. Eleanor Blackwood had no intention of coming around. She had been waiting for this moment, this public stage, to make her position unmistakably clear to everyone present. This wasn't about a photograph. This was about power, control, and her determination to define what constituted a real Blackwood family member. What she didn't know was that Jasper had been watching, listening, and learning about the Blackwood family for 3 years. And what he had discovered was something that would shake the very foundation of Eleanor's carefully constructed family narrative. The exclusions hadn't always been so bold. In the beginning, Eleanor Blackwood was a master of what I came to think of as death by 1,000 paper cuts, small slights that were just subtle enough to be dismissed as accidents or oversights, but consistent enough to send a clear message. It started during our engagement party at the Crystal Harbor Yacht Club. Eleanor had insisted on planning the entire event, claiming it was tradition for the mother of the groom to handle such occasions. She spared no expense, imported flowers from the Netherlands, a string quartet from the Millbrook Heights Symphony, and enough champagne to float one of the Blackwood cargo ships. Every detail was perfect, except for one glaring omission. When the photographer arrived to capture the official engagement announcement photos for the society pages of the Harbor Point Gazette, Eleanor directed him to take pictures of Thomas, and me, then Thomas with his family, then me with the Blackwood relatives. But when Jasper, who had been sitting quietly at a corner table coloring in a book Thomas had brought him, approached to join the family photos, Eleanor suddenly remembered an urgent phone call she simply had to take. "Oh dear, we'll have to finish these later," she announced, just as Jasper reached my side. "Harrison, pack up your equipment. We'll reschedule." But we never did reschedule. The engagement photos that ran in the newspaper the following Sunday showed Thomas and me looking blissfully happy, surrounded by the Blackwood family. Jasper existed only in the written caption. "Thomas Blackwood, son of Eleanor Blackwood of V." Millbrook Heights announces his engagement to Isabella Martinez. The couple will wed next spring at Willowbrook Gardens. No mention of Isabella's son. No mention that Thomas was about to become a stepfather. The pattern continued through our wedding planning. Eleanor offered to pay for everything: the venue, the flowers, the catering, even my dress. But her generosity came with conditions. The guest list had to be approved by her. The seating chart required her final say. And somehow, through a series of unfortunate miscommunications, several of my closest friends and family members never received their invitations. Most devastating was what happened with my sister, Carmen, who had flown in from Phoenix specifically to be my maid of honor. When she arrived at the Willowbrook Gardens Chapel, the wedding coordinator, handpicked by Eleanor, informed her that there had been a last-minute change to the bridal party lineup. Apparently, Eleanor's niece, Penelope, had decided she wanted to participate after all, and since she was true family, she would be taking Carmen's place. Carmen spent my wedding day sitting in the 3rd row, watching a stranger walk down the aisle in the role that should have been hers. When I tried to protest, Thomas was already at the altar, and Eleanor reminded me that she had invested significant money in making this day perfect, and surely I wouldn't want to cause a scene. That would embarrass the Blackwood name. But it was Jasper who bore the brunt of Eleanor's calculated cruelty. During our honeymoon in Tuscany, she convinced Thomas that it would be easier if Jasper stayed with my mother in Riverside Commons rather than with Eleanor at the Blackwood estate. She painted it as a kindness, giving the little one familiar surroundings while his mother was away. But I knew better. She simply couldn't bear the thought of neighbors seeing her with a Hispanic child and having to explain the situation. When we returned from Italy, Jasper was quiet for days. Finally, he asked me why Grandma Eleanor's house was too fancy for him to visit. My mother later told me that he had spent the entire week asking if he had done something wrong, if that was why he couldn't stay with his new grandmother like other kids got to do. The Christmas after our wedding was when Eleanor's true colors became impossible to ignore. She had invited the entire extended family to the estate for her famous Christmas Eve dinner, a formal affair with place cards, multiple courses, and gifts arranged under a 20-foot Fraser fir that was decorated by professional designers, from Harbor Point's most exclusive florist. Every grandchild had a pile of presents with their name written in Eleanor's distinctive calligraphy. Every grandchild except Jasper. When he noticed that there was nothing under the tree for him, Eleanor expressed surprise and claimed she had been so busy with the other children that she had simply forgotten. She handed him a hastily wrapped book from her library, a dusty copy of Maritime History of New England that was clearly meant for an adult. "I'm sure you'll grow into it, dear," she said, with that tight smile I had learned to dread. Jasper, who was 6 at the time, thanked her politely and sat quietly for the rest of the evening, clutching that inappropriate book while his step-cousins played with age-appropriate toys and games. Thomas was furious, but Eleanor dismissed his anger as overreaction and suggested that perhaps they had different expectations about gift-giving. But the worst incident happened 6 months later, during Victoria's daughter Sophia's 8th birthday party at the Millbrook Heights Country Club. Eleanor had organized an elaborate princess-themed celebration with pony rides, face painting, and a magic show. All the Blackwood children were invited, including several of Sophia's friends. From her private school, prestigious academy, Jasper had been so excited. He had helped me pick out a special gift for Sophia and had practiced singing Happy Birthday for weeks. But when we arrived at the country club, Eleanor pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "Isabella? Darling, I'm afraid there's been a terrible mix-up," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The country club has very strict policies about membership and guest lists. They've informed me that Jasper won't be able to participate in today's activities." I knew it was a lie. I had called the country club myself the week before to confirm the details. But Eleanor held all the cards. She was a longtime member, she had paid for the party, and she had positioned herself as the innocent victim of unfortunate club policies that were beyond her control. Thomas confronted her later, that evening, but Eleanor had her story perfectly crafted. She produced fake documentation about new club policies, and even suggested that perhaps Thomas didn't understand how exclusive establishments operated. She made him feel naive for questioning her, turning his anger into self-doubt. That night, as I tucked Jasper into bed, he asked me a question that broke my heart. "Mom, why don't I fit in with the Blackwood family?" I had tried to explain about different kinds of families, about how love was more important than blood, about how some people needed time to adjust to change. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they weren't enough. Jasper was smart. He could see the pattern as clearly as I could. What I didn't know then was that Jasper had been keeping his own mental record of every slight, every exclusion, every moment when Eleanor Blackwood had made him feel less than worthy. And he had been putting together pieces of information that would eventually reveal a truth so shocking that it would force Eleanor to confront not just her treatment of him, but the very foundation of her precious Blackwood family legacy. The Invitation to this year's family portrait session had arrived 3 weeks ago, but it wasn't addressed to our family like previous years. This time, it came specifically addressed to Thomas and Isabella Blackwood, with no mention of Jasper anywhere on the elegant cream cardstock. When I called Victoria to ask if it was an oversight, she had gotten unusually quiet on the phone. "Mom's been particular about this year's portrait," Victoria finally admitted. "She's hired some fancy photographer from the city, and she's treating it like it's going to be featured in Architectural Digest or something. She's even having the formal living room professionally redecorated just for the session." That should have been my first warning sign. Eleanor had always been meticulous about the family portraits, but this level of preparation was unprecedented. She had commissioned Harrison Mills, whose work had been featured in Vanity Fair and who typically photographed celebrity families and political dynasties. She'd spent thousands on new furniture arrangements, custom window treatments, and even had the estate's century-old hardwood floors refinished to achieve the perfect gleam. But the real catalyst for today's confrontation had happened 2 weeks ago, during what Eleanor called her final planning meeting at the Blackwood estate. She had summoned all the adult children to discuss wardrobe coordination, seating arrangements, and what she termed the overall aesthetic vision for the portrait. I had assumed Jasper and I were both included in this vision. After all, we had been part of the family for 3 years now. Jasper called Thomas Dad and had started hyphenating his last name at school, proudly telling his teachers he was Jasper Martinez Blackwood. He had Thomas's business card taped to his bedroom wall and would tell anyone who would listen that his dad moved ships all around the world. During that meeting, Eleanor unveiled her plans with the precision of a military strategist. She had created detailed charts showing where each family member would be positioned, what colors they would wear, and even how they should style their hair. The portrait would include 4 generations of Blackwoods, Eleanor herself, her 3, adult children, their spouses, and all 7 grandchildren. All 7 grandchildren. I counted them twice, thinking I had made a mistake. Victoria's 3 children, Sophia, now 9, Marcus Jr., 7, and baby Charlotte, just 18 months old. Thomas's brother David had twin boys, Ethan and Evan, both 5 years old. His sister Margaret had 2 daughters, 12-year-old Grace and 10-year-old Hope. 7 grandchildren. Jasper wasn't on the list. When I pointed this out, Eleanor didn't even blink. "Oh, Isabella, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said in that maddeningly calm voice she used when delivering her cruelest pronouncements. "This portrait is specifically documenting the Blackwood bloodline. It's for posterity. You understand. Future generations will look at this photograph to understand their heritage." Thomas had started to object, but Eleanor held up her hand with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Thomas, dear, I know you're fond of the boy, but we must be practical about these things. This portrait will hang in the main hallway alongside portraits dating back to 1847. Each one documents the true Blackwood lineage. We can't simply dilute that history for sentimental reasons." The room had gone silent. Margaret stared at her hands. David cleared his throat uncomfortably. Victoria, who had always been the most diplomatic of the siblings, attempted to find middle ground. "Mother, perhaps we could take 2 portraits, one with just the biological family and another including everyone." Eleanor's expression had turned to ice. "There will be 1 portrait, 1 official record, and it will represent what this family actually is, not what we pretend it might be." That's when Thomas finally exploded. "Jasper is part of this family. He's been my son for 3 years, Mother. I love him like he's my own blood." "But he isn't. Your blood," Eleanor replied with devastating simplicity. "And love, while admirable, doesn't change genetics. This portrait isn't about your current emotional attachments, Thomas. It's about preserving something permanent, something real." The meeting had ended with Thomas storming out, slamming the heavy oak door so hard that it rattled the crystal chandelier in the foyer. I had followed him, my hands shaking with rage and humiliation. But Eleanor's voice had followed us down the hallway. "The portrait session is scheduled for October 15th at 2 o'clock. I trust you'll both dress appropriately." That night, Thomas had paced our bedroom like a caged animal. "I should pull out entirely," he kept saying. "If she won't include Jasper, then she doesn't get me either." But I knew it wasn't that simple. Thomas was set to take over Blackwood Maritime Solutions within the next 2 years. His entire career, his financial future, and his ability to provide for our family depended on maintaining his position within the Blackwood dynasty. Eleanor held the controlling shares of the company, and she wasn't above using financial leverage to get her way. She had done it before when David had briefly dated someone she disapproved of, temporarily freezing his access to his trust fund until he came to his senses. For 2 weeks, we had debated whether to attend at all. Thomas wanted to boycott the entire event, but I convinced him that would only make things worse. "She's testing us," I told him. "She wants to see if she can divide us, make you choose between your family legacy and your current family. If we don't show up, she wins." So we had decided to attend, but with our own plan. We would arrive together, all 3 of us, dressed in the coordinated outfits Eleanor had specified. We would force her to make the exclusion public, in front of the entire extended family and the expensive photographer she had hired. We would make her say the words out loud, in front of witnesses, so that everyone could see exactly what kind of person Eleanor Blackwood really was. What we hadn't anticipated was how it would feel to actually stand there, watching our 8-year-old son realize that his grandmother, the woman he had been trying so hard to please for 3 years, considered him unworthy of being preserved in the family's permanent record. But as Jasper stepped forward, looking up at Eleanor with those clear, intelligent eyes, I sensed that something was different about this moment. This wasn't the confused, hurt little boy who had sat quietly through Christmas dinners and birthday parties, accepting whatever scraps of attention Eleanor decided to throw his way. This was a child who had been watching, listening, and learning. And he was about to teach Eleanor Blackwood a lesson she would never forget. The silence that followed Eleanor's declaration stretched like a taut wire across the marble foyer. Harrison Mills, the photographer, had stopped adjusting his equipment and was now openly staring at the unfolding drama. His assistant, a young woman named Rebecca, clutched her light meter against her chest and looked like she wanted to disappear into the wallpaper. Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with anger that he could no longer contain. "Mother, I told you 2 weeks ago that if Jasper isn't in this portrait, then neither am I. We're a package deal." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and brittle, echoing off the crystal chandelier above us. "Oh, Thomas, you're being dramatic again. Just like when you were 12 and threatened to run away because I wouldn't let you keep that stray cat." She turned to address the rest of the family who had gathered in a loose semicircle around us, their faces a mixture of discomfort and morbid curiosity. "Children, please go into the living room with Mr. Mills," Eleanor announced, clapping her hands together with false cheerfulness. "We adults need to have a brief discussion about the arrangements." But none of the children moved. Sophia, Victoria's 9-year-old daughter, stood frozen beside her mother, her eyes wide with confusion. The twins, Ethan and Evan, seemed to sense the tension and moved closer to their father, David. Even baby Charlotte had stopped babbling and was staring at Eleanor with the uncanny perception that very young children sometimes possess. "Actually," said Margaret, Thomas's older sister, her voice carefully measured, "I think the children should hear this. After all, they're old enough to understand what's happening here." Eleanor's eyes flashed with irritation. Margaret had always been the most independent of her children, the one most likely to challenge her authority. "Margaret, this is neither the time nor the place for—" "For what, Mother?" Margaret interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "For honesty? For treating all the children in this family with equal respect? Victoria shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between her loyalty to her mother and her growing unease with the situation. Maybe we could just include everyone today and discuss the details later, she suggested weakly. There are no details to discuss, Eleanor snapped, her composure finally beginning to crack. This is my home, my family, and my portrait. I will not have 43 years of Blackwood tradition compromised by modern sentimentality. That's when David, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. Mother, with all due respect, Jasper has been part of our family gatherings for 3 years. The twins ask about their cousin Jasper all the time. To them, he's already family. Eleanor whirled around to face David, her steel gray hair perfectly styled but her eyes blazing, with fury. And that, David, is exactly the problem. You've all become too comfortable with this arrangement. You've forgotten what it means to be a Blackwood. What it means to be a Blackwood? Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet now, the kind of controlled anger that was far more frightening than shouting. What exactly does that mean, Mother? Because I thought it meant loyalty, integrity, and taking care of the people we love. Eleanor's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. It means understanding the difference between temporary relationships and permanent legacy. It means recognizing that some connections, no matter how emotionally satisfying, don't change fundamental realities. I felt Jasper's hand slip back into mine, and I could feel him trembling slightly. But when I looked down at him, his face wasn't showing the hurt and confusion I expected. Instead, there was something else there, a kind of calm determination that reminded me eerily of Eleanor herself. Mrs. Blackwood, Harrison Mills interrupted hesitantly, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before him. Perhaps I should step outside while you resolve this. We can reschedule if necessary. There's nothing to resolve, Eleanor declared, smoothing her navy silk blouse with decisive strokes. Mr. Mills, please proceed with setting up in the living room. We'll be ready to begin in 10 minutes. She started to walk toward the living room, clearly considering the matter closed, but Thomas caught her arm. Mother, I'm serious. If Jasper isn't in this portrait, then Isabella and I are leaving. Right now. Eleanor stopped and turned back to face him, her expression shifting from irritation to something much more calculated and cold. Are you threatening me, Thomas? I'm stating a fact. I see. Eleanor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried more menace than if she had screamed. And have you thought about what such a decision might mean for your future with Blackwood Maritime? Have you considered how the board of directors might view a man who abandons his family over a tantrum? The threat hung in the air like poison. Gas. Everyone in that room knew exactly what Eleanor was saying. Thomas's position as heir apparent to the family business, his financial security, his ability to provide for Jasper and me. All of it depended on Eleanor's approval. Victoria gasped softly. Margaret's face went pale. David looked like he might be sick. They all understood that their mother had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But before Thomas could respond, before anyone could break the horrible tension that had settled over the room like a suffocating blanket, Jasper did something that caught everyone completely off guard. He let go of my hand and walked directly up to Eleanor, stopping just inches from her perfectly pressed skirt. Then he looked up at her with those bright green eyes and asked, in a voice so clear and innocent that it carried to every corner of the room, "Grandma Eleanor, can I ask you something?" Eleanor blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the unexpected question. For a moment, her mask of controlled authority slipped, and she looked genuinely uncertain. What is it, dear?" Jasper smiled then, the kind of sweet, guileless smile that had charmed teachers, neighbors, and strangers in grocery stores for his entire 8 years of life. But there was something different about this smile, something that made me hold my breath. "I was just wondering," he said, his voice carrying that particular clarity that children possess when they're about to say something that will change everything. "Why you don't want me in the family picture when Grandpa Richard always said I was his favorite great-grandchild?" The effect of those words was immediate and devastating. Eleanor's face went completely white. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth. Margaret made a small choking sound. David's eyes went wide with shock. And Thomas looked like he had just seen a ghost. Eleanor's face had turned the color of old parchment, and for the first time in the 3 years I had known her, she seemed genuinely speechless. The name Grandpa Richard hung in the air like a thunderclap, and I could see the exact moment when everyone in that room realized that 8-year-old Jasper knew something that could shatter Eleanor's carefully constructed world. "What did you just say?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. Jasper tilted his head with the innocent curiosity of a child who doesn't understand why the adults around him have suddenly frozen like statues. "I said Grandpa Richard told me I was his favorite great-grandchild. He used to call me every month before he died. Don't you remember him?" The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face had gone as white as her mother's. Margaret was gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles were bone white. David looked like he was having trouble breathing. And Thomas was staring at Jasper with an expression of complete bewilderment. "Jasper," Thomas said slowly, his voice carefully controlled. "Who exactly is Grandpa Richard?" But before Jasper could answer, Eleanor found her voice again, though it came out as a strangled croak. "That's impossible. Richard he wouldn't have—" She trailed off, seeming to realize that whatever she was about to say would only make things worse. Jasper, completely oblivious to the bomb he had just detonated, reached into the small messenger bag he always carried, the one Thomas had bought him for his first day of second grade. He pulled out a manila folder that looked far too official for a child to be carrying. "Mom said I should bring this today because it's important family stuff," Jasper explained matter-of-factly. "Grandpa Richard gave it to Mom before he died and told her to make sure I always had it." I felt my knees go weak. The folder. I had completely forgotten about the folder. Richard Blackwood, Eleanor's late husband and Thomas's father, had died 18 months ago from complications following heart surgery, but 2 weeks before his death, during one of his lucid moments, he had asked to see me privately. I had assumed he wanted to say goodbye, perhaps offer some words of wisdom about taking care of Thomas. Instead, he had handed me that manila folder, with instructions that seemed strange at the time but now made perfect, terrifying sense. "Isabella," he had said, his voice weak but his eyes sharp with purpose. "There are things about this family that Eleanor has never told anyone. Things she's buried so deep she probably believes her own lies by now. But children deserve to know the truth about where they come from." At the time, I thought he was referring to general family history, maybe old documents or photographs. That might help Jasper understand his place in the Blackwood legacy. I had put the folder away in our safe deposit box and honestly forgotten about it until this morning, when Jasper had specifically asked if he could bring the important papers Grandpa Richard gave me. Now, watching Eleanor's face crumble as Jasper opened that folder, I realized that Richard Blackwood had been planning for this exact moment. Jasper pulled out a stack of documents and photographs, handling them with the careful reverence of a child who understood they were precious. The first item was a birth certificate, yellowed with age and bearing the seal of the Millbrook Heights Municipal Records Office. "This is really old," Jasper announced, holding up the document for everyone to see. "It's for someone named Richard, Anthony Martinez, born in 1953. Grandpa Richard said it was his first birth certificate before he became a Blackwood." The effect on Eleanor was immediate and devastating. She let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob, and had to steady herself against the marble wall. "No," she whispered. "Richard, you promised me. You swore you would never. But Jasper wasn't finished. He pulled out a black and white photograph showing a young man who looked remarkably like Thomas, standing beside a beautiful Hispanic woman in front of a small house in what appeared to be a working-class neighborhood. This is Grandpa Richard. With his first mommy, Jasper explained with the casual matter-of-factness that only children possess when discussing life-altering revelations. Her name was Maria Elena Martinez. She died when Grandpa Richard was 16, and that's when he got adopted by the Blackwood family and changed his name. Victoria made a choking sound. Margaret sank into the nearest chair. David was staring at the photograph like it might burst into flames. But Jasper still wasn't done. He pulled out what appeared to be adoption papers, legal documents that were clearly authentic despite their age, and a letter written in Richard Blackwood's distinctive handwriting. Grandpa Richard wrote this letter for me, Jasper said, unfolding the paper carefully. Mom, you said I could read it today if the family was all together. Can I read it now? I nodded, unable to speak. My throat felt like it was closing up, and I could barely comprehend what was happening. Richard Blackwood, the patriarch of this exclusive, bloodline-obsessed family, had been adopted. He had been born Hispanic. He had hidden this truth for over 60 years. Jasper cleared his throat and began to read in his clear 8-year-old voice. Dear Jasper, if you are reading this letter to the Blackwood family, it means that someone has tried to make you feel like you don't belong. It means that my wife, Eleanor, has probably forgotten the most important truth about our family. We are all immigrants, all adopted, all chosen rather than born into privilege. Eleanor slumped against the wall, tears streaming down her face. Thomas looked like he was in shock. The entire room had gone so quiet that the only sound was Jasper's young voice reading his grandfather's words. My birth name was Richard Anthony Martinez. I was born to Mexican immigrants in the Riverside Commons neighborhood of Millbrook Heights. When my mother died and my father couldn't care for me, the Blackwood family adopted me because they needed an heir to continue their business legacy. I have spent 67 years hiding this truth, and it has been the greatest shame of my life. Jasper looked up from the letter, his eyes bright with excitement rather than understanding the magnitude of what he was revealing. There's more, he announced cheerfully. Should I keep reading? Thomas found his voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Keep reading, Jasper, please. Eleanor tried to step forward, her hand reaching out as if she could somehow stop the words that were about to pour from that letter, but Margaret caught her arm. No, Mother, Margaret said firmly. We need to hear this, all of it. Jasper looked around the room with the satisfied expression of a child who suddenly found himself the center of attention for a good reason. He smoothed the letter carefully and continued reading in his clear, innocent voice. The Blackwood family took me in when I was 16, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. The original Blackwood line had ended with Jonathan Blackwood III, who died without male heirs in 1969. The family business needed someone to carry the name forward, and I was chosen because I was young enough to be molded and grateful enough to never question the arrangement. Victoria let out a soft gasp. But the family tree in the main hallway shows an unbroken line going back to 1847. Fabricated, Eleanor whispered, so quietly that everyone had to strain to hear her. All of it. Richard and we created a fictional genealogy to maintain the prestige. We thought it was what the family needed. Jasper, oblivious to the implications of what he was revealing, continued reading. They gave me a new birth certificate, new documents, and a new history. Eleanor and I were married when I was 22, and she was the only person who knew the truth about my origins. We agreed that it would remain our secret forever. Thomas staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck. My entire life, everything I thought I knew about our family history, was a lie, David finished, his voice hollow with shock. The portraits, the stories about our ancestors, the maritime legacy. The maritime legacy is real, Eleanor said desperately, finally finding her voice again. Richard built that business from nothing. He earned his place in this family through hard work and dedication. The Blackwood name means something because of what he accomplished, not because of where he came from. But Jasper was still reading, and Richard's letter wasn't finished revealing its secrets. But the most important thing I want you to know, Jasper, is why I decided to tell you this truth. 3 years ago, when your mother married my son Thomas, I watched Eleanor treat you the same way she had watched others treat me when I was young, like an outsider who didn't truly belong. I saw her exclude you from family photos, forget your birthday, and pretend you were invisible at family gatherings. Eleanor's face crumpled completely. "Richard, how could you?" she whispered to the air, as if her dead husband could somehow hear her protest. "And I realized," Jasper continued, his voice growing stronger as he sensed the importance of the words he was speaking, "that I had spent 67 years being complicit in the very same prejudice that I had suffered from. I had allowed Eleanor to create a family identity based on exclusion and fear, when I knew better than anyone that families are built on love and choice, not blood and birth certificates." Harrison Mills, the photographer, had stopped all pretense of working and was now openly staring at the family drama unfolding before him. His assistant, Rebecca, looked like she was witnessing a historical moment, which in many ways she was. Margaret stood up from her chair, her face flushed with anger. "Mother, do you realize what this means? Everything we've been told about our superiority, our bloodline, our legacy, it's all been built on a foundation of lies." "Not lies," Eleanor protested weakly. "Choices. We made choices to protect what?" "We had built? You mean choices to protect your prejudices?" Thomas said, his voice growing harder with each word. "All these years, you've made my son feel less than worthy, when your own husband, my father, came from the exact same background." But the letter wasn't finished. Jasper pulled out another document from the folder, a legal paper that looked much more recent than the others. "Grandpa Richard also wrote this," he announced, holding up what appeared to be a notarized statement. "He gave Mom a copy, but he also filed it with his lawyer and the county records office." "What does it say?" Victoria asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Jasper read the header carefully. "Official Statement of Family Heritage and Recognition, dated 6 months before Grandpa Richard died." He looked up proudly. "It's about me." Eleanor reached for the wall again, clearly anticipating another devastating revelation. "I, Richard Anthony Martinez Blackwood," Jasper read, "do hereby officially recognize and acknowledge Jasper Daniel Martinez Blackwood as my great-grandson, and a full member of the Blackwood family with all rights, privileges, and inheritance considerations that such recognition entails." The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence. This wasn't the shocked quiet that had followed the revelation of Richard's origins. This was the silence of people realizing that everything they thought they knew about power, legitimacy, and family hierarchy had just been turned upside down. "There's more," Jasper announced cheerfully, clearly enjoying his moment in the spotlight. "Grandpa Richard says that anyone who tries to exclude me from family activities or portraits is acting against his express wishes and dishonoring the memory of Maria Elena Martinez, who taught him that family is defined by love, not by law." Thomas walked slowly toward Eleanor, his face a mixture of betrayal and rage. 67 years, Mother. You let Dad hide his heritage for 67 years, and then you had the audacity to exclude my son for the exact same background that you helped. Dad Barry. Eleanor was crying openly now, mascara streaming down her cheeks in dark rivulets. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "It was different then. Society was different. We had to fit in. We had to be accepted." "And what about now?" Margaret demanded. "What's your excuse now for treating an 8-year-old child like he's somehow contaminated your precious bloodline?" But before Eleanor could answer, Jasper pulled one final item from the folder, a photograph that was clearly much more recent than the others. In it, Richard Blackwood sat on a park bench with Jasper, both of them grinning at the camera. The back, in Richard's handwriting, were the words, "Maria Elena's great-grandson and mine. The Martinez legacy continues." Jasper held up the photo for everyone to see. Grandpa Richard said this was the most important picture he ever took because it showed that love is stronger than secrets. And in that moment, looking at that photograph, everyone in the room understood that Jasper hadn't just revealed Richard's hidden past. He had revealed the fundamental lie upon which Eleanor's entire worldview had been constructed. The silence that followed Jasper's final revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity. Eleanor stood against the marble wall, her carefully constructed facade crumbling like ancient parchment. The woman who had controlled this family with an iron fist for decades looked suddenly frail, diminished, as if the weight of her exposed lies was physically crushing her. Thomas was the first to move. He walked slowly toward his mother, each step deliberate and measured. When he reached her, his voice was barely controlled. "Look at me, Mother." Eleanor raised her tear-stained face, and for the first time in my memory, she looked genuinely afraid. 67 years, Thomas repeated, his voice growing stronger. "You let my father live in shame about his heritage for 67 years. You helped him bury the truth about who he was, where he came from, and what his birth mother sacrificed. To give him life. And then, you had the unmitigated gall to exclude my son from this family for having the exact same background. Thomas, please, you have to understand," Eleanor began, but Margaret cut her off. "No, Mother. We're done with your explanations. We're done with your excuses." Margaret's voice was shaking with fury. "I want to know exactly how many family traditions, how many sacred Blackwood customs, how many stories about our pure bloodline were complete fabrications." Victoria, who had been silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally found her voice. "The Maritime Heritage Museum display in Dad's study. Is any of that real?" Eleanor's response was barely a whisper. "The business accomplishments are real. Richard built Blackwood Maritime from a small regional operation into what it is today. But the family history—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "The family history is fiction," David said flatly. "The portraits in the hallway, the genealogy charts, the stories about our ancestors sailing from England in the 1800s, all of it is made up." Harrison Mills cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should leave and allow your family to—" "No," Thomas said sharply, turning to face the photographer. "Stay. You're going to take our family portrait today, Mr. Mills. All of us, including my son." He looked back at Eleanor with steel in his eyes. "Because it turns out that Jasper has more legitimate claim to the Blackwood name than any of us realized." Eleanor straightened slightly, trying to regain some semblance of her former authority. "Thomas, I know you're angry, but we can't just— Can't? Just what?" Margaret interrupted. "Can't just tell the truth? Can't just acknowledge that our entire family identity has been built on prejudice and lies? Can't just admit that an 8-year-old child has shown more courage and honesty in 10 minutes than we've shown in decades?" That's when Jasper, who had been quietly observing the adult drama swirling around him, stepped forward again. He walked directly to Eleanor and looked up at her with those clear, intelligent eyes that had started this entire revelation. "Grandma, Eleanor," he said softly. "Grandpa Richard told me that you were scared when you were young. He said that's why you and he decided to hide who he really was. Is that true?" Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. She sank to her knees, putting herself at eye level with Jasper, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, that's true. When your grandfather and I got married, things were different. People like us, people from different backgrounds, We weren't accepted in society the way we are now. We thought we had to hide. We thought we had to pretend to be something we weren't in order to succeed. Jasper nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to him. But Grandpa Richard said that hiding made him feel bad about himself for his whole life. He said he didn't want me to feel bad about myself the way he did. He was right, Eleanor sobbed. God help me, he was right, and I was too stubborn and too frightened to see it. Victoria knelt down beside her mother, her own eyes filled with tears. Mom, why didn't you just tell us? Why did you let us grow up believing we were somehow better than other people? Eleanor looked around the room at her children and grandchildren, her face a portrait of anguish and regret. Because I thought I was protecting what we had built. I thought I was preserving something important. But all I was really doing was perpetuating the same fear and prejudice that made Richard feel ashamed of his own mother. Thomas crouched down next to Jasper and put his hand on his son's shoulder. Jasper, do you understand what's happening here? Jasper considered the question seriously. I think Grandma Eleanor was afraid that if people knew the truth about Grandpa Richard, they wouldn't think our family was important anymore. But Grandpa Richard said that families are important because of how they love each other, not because of old papers and pictures. That's exactly right, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. Jasper turned back to Eleanor, who was still kneeling on the marble floor. Grandma Eleanor, I forgive you for not wanting me in the pictures before. Grandpa Richard said that sometimes people do mean things when they're scared, but that doesn't mean they're mean people. The effect of those words on Eleanor was immediate and profound. She reached out tentatively, as if asking permission, and when Jasper nodded, she pulled him into a fierce hug. I'm so sorry, she whispered into his hair. I'm so very, very sorry. Jasper, you are my grandson, and you deserve so much better than what I've given you. Margaret walked over to Harrison Mills, who had been standing frozen throughout the entire confrontation. Mr. Mills, I believe we're ready for our family portrait now. All of us. The photographer nodded quickly, clearly eager to move past the emotional upheaval he had witnessed. Of course. Should we proceed to the living room? But Eleanor stood up slowly, still holding Jasper's hand. Wait, she said, her voice stronger now, though still shaky. Before we take this portrait, there's something I need to do. She walked to the ornate telephone table in the corner of the foyer and picked up her cell phone. With deliberate movements, she dialed a number and put the phone on speaker. Harbor Point Gazette, Society Desk. This is Miranda speaking. Eleanor's voice was clear and steady when she spoke. Miranda, this is Eleanor Blackwood. I need to submit a correction to our family's historical records that will be running alongside our annual portrait in next week's Society section. Thomas's eyes widened. Margaret gasped softly. Victoria covered her mouth with her hand. What kind of correction, Mrs. Blackwood? Miranda's voice crackled through the speaker. Eleanor looked directly at Jasper as she spoke. I need to add information about my late husband's heritage and formally acknowledge my grandson, Jasper Martinez Blackwood, as a full and cherished member of our family. It's time the public record reflected the truth. 3 months later, I stood in that same marble foyer, but everything had changed. The portrait that Harrison Mills had taken that day now hung in the place of honor in the main hallway. A beautiful family photograph showing 4 generations of Blackwoods, with Jasper positioned right in the center next to Eleanor, both of them smiling genuinely at the camera. But it wasn't the only new addition to the hallway. Beside it hung a smaller, more intimate photograph, the picture of Richard Blackwood with his birth mother, Maria Elena Martinez, that Jasper had revealed from his folder. Below it, a small brass plaque read, Maria Elena Martinez, 1935-1969, the true foundation of the Blackwood family legacy. The fabricated genealogy charts had been quietly removed and replaced with an honest family history that acknowledged Richard's adoption and celebrated rather than hid his Mexican heritage. Eleanor had personally overseen every change, working, with a genealogist to create an accurate record that honored both Richard's birth family and the Blackwoods who had given him opportunities. The newspaper article that had run the week after our portrait session had sent shockwaves through Millbrook Heights society. Eleanor's public acknowledgement of her family's hidden history, combined with her formal apology to Jasper, had been front-page news in the Harbor Point Gazette. Some of their social circle had been scandalized, but surprisingly, many more had reached out with support and similar stories of their own family secrets. "Families are complicated," Eleanor had told the reporter. "I spent too many years trying to make ours seem simple and perfect. But the truth is, our strength comes from overcoming challenges, not from pretending we never had any." Today was Thanksgiving, and the Blackwood estate was filled with a warmth that had been missing for years. The dining room table, which had always been set with military precision and formal place cards, now had a more relaxed arrangement. Jasper sat beside Eleanor, helping her fold napkins and chattering about his school project on family immigration stories. And then Mrs. Patterson said that almost everyone in America has a family story about coming from somewhere else, Jasper was explaining enthusiastically. She said that's what makes us American, that we're all mixed up together from different places. Eleanor smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "Mrs. Patterson sounds very wise. What are you going to write about for your project?" "I'm going to write about Grandpa Richard and his first mommy, Maria Elena," Jasper announced, proudly, "and about how he was brave enough to build a new life, but how it took me to help him tell the truth about where he came from." Thomas walked into the dining room carrying a platter of turkey, and he paused to kiss the top of Jasper's head. "Are you going to mention how you turned our entire family upside down in one afternoon?" Jasper giggled. "Mom says I didn't turn the family upside down. She says I turned it right side up." And that was exactly what had happened. The revelation of Richard's heritage had done more than just expose Eleanor's hypocrisy. It had freed the entire family from the burden of maintaining an impossible standard of perfection. Margaret had started talking openly about her struggles with anxiety, something she had hidden for years because she thought it might reflect poorly on the family name. Victoria had enrolled her children in the local public school instead of the exclusive prestigious academy, saying she wanted them to grow up with a more diverse group of friends. David had begun volunteering at the community center in Riverside Commons, the same neighborhood where Richard Blackwood had been born. But the most profound change had been in Eleanor herself. The woman who had once ruled the family with fear and rigid expectations had become someone I barely recognized, someone I actually enjoyed spending time with. She had started learning Spanish, saying she wanted to be able to speak with the families of her employees at Blackwood Maritime in their native language. She had also established a scholarship fund at the local community college specifically for first-generation immigrants pursuing business degrees. "I can't undo 67 years of hiding," she had told me during one of our regular coffee meetings, a tradition that had started unexpectedly a month after the portrait incident. "But I can make sure that future generations of our family never feel like they have to choose between honoring their heritage and claiming their place in American society." The front door chimed, and Victoria's family arrived, followed closely by Margaret and her daughters. The house filled with the sounds of children laughing, adults catching up, and the comfortable chaos of a real family gathering rather than a formal social performance. As we all gathered around the table for Eleanor's traditional Thanksgiving toast, she stood up and raised her glass. But instead of her usual speech about Blackwood traditions and family legacy, she said something completely different. "I want to thank Jasper today for teaching this old woman that the most important family tradition is telling the truth. And I want to thank all of you for forgiving me when that truth was harder to accept than the lies I had been telling." She turned to look directly at Jasper, who was sitting beside her with cranberry sauce on his chin and a proud smile on his face. "Most of all, I want to thank my grandson for showing me that courage doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes, it looks like an 8-year-old boy who refuses to be invisible, even when the adults around him are too scared to see clearly. Jasper raised his small glass of apple cider. I want to thank Grandpa Richard for trusting me with the truth, and Grandma Eleanor for being brave enough to tell everyone else. As we all clinked glasses and began to eat, I reflected on how completely our lives had changed in such a short time. Jasper no longer asked why he didn't fit in with the Blackwood family, because he finally understood that he didn't just fit in, he belonged completely and unconditionally. Thomas had been promoted to CEO of Blackwood Maritime ahead of schedule, with Eleanor saying that a man who would risk everything to defend his family was exactly the kind of leader the company needed. And I had found something I never expected: to have a real relationship with my mother-in-law, built on honesty rather than tolerance. After dinner, as the children played in the garden and the adults relaxed in the living room, I found myself looking at that portrait hanging in the hallway. It captured a moment of transformation, not just of our family, but of what it means to belong somewhere. Because in the end, this story isn't really about a family photograph. It's about the courage to claim your place in the world, even when others tell you that you don't belong. It's about the power of truth to transform relationships that seemed broken beyond repair. And it's about understanding that the strongest families aren't built on shared blood or fabricated histories, but on the willingness to see each other clearly and love what you find there. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that belonging is something you claim rather than something you're granted, then I hope you carry that truth with you. Sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths, and sometimes it takes a child to remind adults what really matters. Have you ever had to stand up for your place in a family or community that didn't immediately welcome you? Have you ever discovered that the things you thought made you different were actually what made you strong? Share your story in the comments, because every family has secrets, but the best families are brave enough to turn those secrets into sources of strength. And remember, you belong everywhere. You have the courage to tell your truth. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 5 years after that life-changing family portrait session. Jasper, now 13, and somehow even more observant than he had been at 8, brought it to me at the breakfast table with a curious expression on his face. "Mom, this came for me," he said, holding up an official-looking envelope with the seal of the National Immigration Museum in Washington, D.C. Why would a museum be writing to me? I set down my coffee cup and examined the envelope. It was addressed specifically to Jasper Daniel Martinez Blackwood, in formal calligraphy, and it had the weight of something important. "Only one way to find out," I said, handing it back to him. "Open it." Jasper carefully tore open the envelope and pulled out a letter printed on museum letterhead, along with several smaller documents. As he read, his eyes grew wider with each sentence. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with excitement and disbelief, "they want to interview me for an exhibit about family heritage and American identity. They say someone nominated my story for their Voices of Courage collection." I leaned over to read the letter myself. The museum was creating a permanent exhibit about how American families navigate questions of belonging, identity, and cultural heritage. Jasper's story, about revealing his great-grandfather's hidden past and transforming his family's understanding of themselves, had been submitted by someone as an example of how children can become catalysts for healing generational wounds. "Who do you think nominated you?" I asked, though I had a strong suspicion. Jasper was already reading the attached documents. "It says here that the nomination came from Eleanor Martinez Blackwood." He looked up at me with a grin. "Grandma Eleanor. Hyphenated her name too?" I smiled, remembering the day 2 years ago when Eleanor had legally changed her name to honor both her own heritage and Richard's. She had discovered that her maiden name, Walsh, was actually an anglicized version of her Irish immigrant great-grandfather's original name, O'Brien. The woman who had once been so concerned with maintaining a pure family identity had embraced the reality that all American families are stories of mixing, adaptation, and transformation. She did, I confirmed. She said if Grandpa Richard could reclaim his true name, so could she. The phone rang, and I wasn't surprised to see Eleanor's number on the caller ID. Jasper answered with his usual enthusiasm. "Hi, Grandma Eleanor. Did you really nominate me for a museum exhibit?" There was a pause as he listened, then he laughed. "You want to what? Hold on, let me ask Mom." He covered the phone with his hand. "Grandma Eleanor wants to know if she can drive down from Millbrook Heights today to talk to me about the museum thing. She says she has something important to show me." 3 hours later, Eleanor arrived at our house in Maple Ridge, carrying a large leather portfolio and wearing the kind of excited expression that had become familiar over the past 5 years. The stern, controlling matriarch I had once feared had been replaced by a woman who approached life with curiosity and genuine joy. "Jasper, darling," she said, giving him the fierce hug that had become their standard greeting. "I hope you're not upset that I submitted your story without asking first. But when I saw the museum's call for nominations, I knew immediately that your experience needed to be shared." Jasper shook his head. "I'm not upset. I think it's cool. But why did you think other people would want to hear about what happened with our family?" Eleanor sat down at our kitchen table and opened the portfolio. Inside were dozens of letters, emails, and newspaper clippings, responses to the original Harbor Point Gazette article about our family's revelation. "Because," Eleanor said, spreading the papers across the table, "it turns out that our story resonated with hundreds of other families. Look at this." She handed Jasper a letter from a woman in California whose grandfather had hidden his Native American heritage for 60 years. Another from a family in Texas who discovered that their founding father ancestor had actually been an indentured servant, not the wealthy landowner they had always believed. A third from a young man in New York who had used Jasper's example to find the courage to tell his traditional Korean family about his biracial daughter. People started reaching out after the article was syndicated nationally, Eleanor explained. Families who had been carrying secrets, children who felt excluded, grandparents who realized they had been perpetuating the same prejudices they had once suffered from. Your courage to speak up that day started conversations in living rooms across America. Jasper read through several of the letters, his face growing more serious with each one. All these people were hiding parts of themselves because they thought they had to? "That's exactly right," Eleanor said. "And many of them said that reading about how you handled our family's situation gave them hope that they could heal their own family divisions." I watched Jasper process this information, seeing the same thoughtful intelligence that had served him so well at 8 years old. "So the museum wants to interview me so that even more families might learn from what happened to us?" The museum director called it the power of authentic family storytelling, Eleanor said, pulling out the final document from her portfolio. "But Jasper, I want you to understand that this is entirely your choice. You're 13 now, old enough to decide for yourself whether you want your story to be public in this way." Jasper was quiet for several minutes, looking through the letters and thinking. Finally, he looked up at both of us with that direct, clear-eyed gaze that had changed everything 5 years ago. "I think Grandpa Richard would want me to do it," he said. "He spent so many years keeping secrets because he was afraid, but those secrets hurt people, including him. If telling our story helps other families stop keeping secrets that hurt people, then I think that's what he would want." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of pride rather than sorrow. "Your great-grandfather would be incredibly proud of the young man you've become, Jasper. And so am I." 6 months later, I stood in the National Immigration Museum, watching Jasper confidently answer questions from a room full of visitors about his family's journey from secrets to truth. The exhibit featuring his story had become one of the most popular displays in the museum, and the video interview he had given was being used in schools across the country to help teachers discuss topics of identity, belonging, and family heritage. But what struck me most wasn't the public recognition or the educational impact of his story. It was watching my son, now a confident teenager who knew exactly who he was and where he came from, help other young people understand that their complex family stories were sources of strength, not shame. After the presentation, a 12-year-old girl approached Jasper shyly. "My grandmother is from El Salvador, but she never talks about it because she says people won't understand," the girl said. "How did you get your grandmother to change her mind about hiding your family's story?" Jasper considered the question seriously, just as he had considered Eleanor's exclusion 5 years earlier. "I think the most important thing is to remember that adults get scared sometimes, just like kids do. My grandmother wasn't mean. She was just afraid that if people knew the truth about our family, they wouldn't think we were good enough. But when I showed her that I was proud of where I came from, it helped her remember that she could be proud too." The girl nodded thoughtfully. "So I should tell my grandmother that I'm proud of being Salvadoran." "Tell her you're proud of being her granddaughter," Jasper suggested. "Tell her you want to learn about her stories because they're part of your story too." As we drove home that evening, Jasper was quiet in the back seat, looking out the window at the passing scenery. Finally, he spoke up. "Mom, do you think our story is really done, or do you think it's still happening?" I smiled, thinking about all the families who were having difficult conversations because a 13-year-old boy had been brave enough to ask why he couldn't be in a family photograph. "I think our story is just beginning, sweetheart. And I think Grandpa Richard and Maria Elena would be amazed to see how far it's traveled. Because that's the thing about courage. It doesn't just change your own life. It ripples outward, touching lives you may never know about, inspiring other people to find their own strength to speak their own truths. And sometimes, it all starts with a single question from a child who refuses to accept that love has limitations." 10. Years had passed since that pivotal day in Eleanor's foyer, and today I found myself standing in the same marble entryway, but this time as the matriarch watching over a very different kind of family gathering. At 23, Jasper had returned home from Stanford Business School for what would become the most important family meeting in Blackwood history. The estate looked much the same, but the portraits lining the hallway told a completely different story now. Alongside the original family photographs hung images that celebrated the full diversity of our extended family. Pictures of Thomas's adoption ceremony when he legally adopted Jasper at age 10. Eleanor dancing at the quinceañera she had thrown. For Jasper's cousin Rosa, the daughter of one of Maria Elena's nephews who had reconnected with our family. And my personal favorite, a photo of Eleanor teaching Spanish to a group of children at the Millbrook Heights Community Center. But today's gathering wasn't about reminiscing, it was about the future. Jasper walked into the foyer carrying a leather briefcase that had once belonged to his great-grandfather Richard, now filled with business plans and legal documents that would reshape everything we thought we knew about. Family legacy. Behind him came Thomas, now 52 and graying at the temples, and Eleanor, 78 but still sharp as ever, followed by Margaret, Victoria, David, and their families. But they weren't the only ones present. Seated in the living room were faces that would have been unimaginable at a Blackwood family meeting a decade ago. Carmen Martinez Santos, Maria Elena's great-niece from Phoenix, who had become a successful immigration attorney. Dr. Miguel Santos, a medical researcher whose grandmother had been Maria Elena's sister. And Elena Rodriguez, a young journalist who had discovered her connection to our family while researching her own genealogy. "Before we begin," Jasper said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had captivated that room 18 years earlier, "I want everyone to understand what we're really discussing today. This isn't just about business succession or financial planning. This is about redefining what it means to be a family in the 21st century." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick document bound in blue legal folders. For the past 2 years, I've been working with a team of lawyers, social workers, and business consultants to create something that has never existed before. A family foundation that operates as both a business entity and a support network for families dealing with heritage identity issues. Eleanor leaned forward in her chair, her eyes bright with curiosity. "What exactly are you proposing, darling?" Jasper smiled, and I could see echoes of both his great-grandfather's determination and his grandmother's strategic mind in his expression. "I'm proposing that we transform Blackwood Maritime Solutions into something bigger, a company that still operates in shipping and logistics, but also functions as a model for how family businesses can become forces for social healing." He turned to address the extended family members who had gathered. "Carmen, your work with immigrant families has shown me that there are thousands of people struggling with the same issues our family faced. Children caught between cultures, families hiding their heritage out of fear, young people who don't know how to honor their past while building their future." Carmen nodded. "The legal clinic sees cases like yours every day, Jasper. Families torn apart by shame about their origins, children denied opportunities because their parents are afraid to claim their full identity. That's exactly why this matters," Jasper continued. "What if Blackwood Maritime became more than just a shipping company? What if it became a place where families like ours could find resources, support, and most importantly, examples of how to turn family secrets into family strengths?" Thomas studied the legal documents Jasper had distributed. "You're talking about fundamentally changing the nature of our business." "I'm talking about expanding it," Jasper corrected. "The shipping and logistics operations would continue exactly as they are. That's our foundation. But we would also create a family heritage consulting division, scholarship programs for first-generation college students, and support networks for families navigating cultural identity issues." Victoria raised her hand tentatively. "Jasper, this sounds wonderful in theory, but how do we make it financially sustainable? We can't just turn a profitable business into a charity." Dr. Miguel Santos cleared his throat. "Actually, there's significant research showing that companies with strong social missions often outperform traditional businesses in terms of employee loyalty, customer satisfaction, and long-term profitability. What Jasper is proposing isn't charity, it's smart business." Eleanor stood up slowly, using the ornate walking stick that had become necessary after a fall 2 years earlier. The room fell silent as everyone waited for her to speak. Despite her age and physical limitations, she still commanded attention when she chose to use it. "Jasper," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 8 decades of life experience. "Do you remember what you asked me that day when you were 8 years old? You asked why you were the only one Grandpa Richard called before he died." Jasper nodded. "I remember. At the time, I thought that question was about inheritance, about who belonged in our family and who didn't. But I understand now that you were really asking why love chooses certain people to carry forward its most important work." Eleanor's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your great-grandfather saw something in you that the rest of us were too blind to recognize. He saw a child who would grow up to understand that families aren't just about preserving what came before. They're about creating something better for what comes next." She turned to address the entire room. "I spent 67 years helping to hide Richard's heritage because I thought it would protect our family's position in society. But what I really did was rob our family of its greatest strength, the knowledge that we had overcome obstacles, that we had built something meaningful from humble beginnings, that we were living proof that love and determination can triumph over prejudice and fear." Eleanor walked slowly to the portrait of Maria Elena Martinez that now held a place of honor in the main hallway. This woman, who I never had the chance to meet, taught her son that family is about more than blood. She taught him that belonging is something you create, not something you inherit. And somehow, through a chain of love that survived decades, of secrecy and shame, that lesson made its way to my grandson. She turned back to face Jasper. If you think you can honor her memory and Richard's legacy by expanding our family's mission to help other families heal their own wounds, then you have my complete support. And more than that, you have my admiration. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Thomas looked stunned. Margaret was openly crying. Victoria reached over to squeeze David's hand, but it was Elena Rodriguez, the young journalist, who asked the question everyone was thinking. "Mrs. Blackwood, are you saying you're willing to step down as head of the family business?" Eleanor's laugh was warm and genuine. "My dear, I stopped being the head of this family the day an 8-year-old boy taught me that wisdom doesn't always come from experience. It sometimes comes from courage." She looked directly at Jasper. "I'm not stepping down. I'm stepping aside to let the real leader of this family take his rightful place." 6 months later, the transformation was complete. Blackwood Maritime Solutions had become Blackwood Heritage Industries, with divisions focusing on logistics, family consulting, educational outreach, and cultural preservation. Jasper served as CEO, with Thomas as President of Operations and Eleanor as Chairman Emeritus. The company's first annual report included testimonials from dozens of families who had found healing through their heritage programs. But for me, the most meaningful change wasn't in the business structure or the financial reports. It was in the portrait that now hung in the main conference room of the company's headquarters, a picture taken during our first annual Family Stories Day, showing representatives from 43 different families who had connected with each other through Blackwood Heritage Industries. In the center of that photograph, surrounded by children and grandparents from every imaginable background, sat Eleanor and Jasper, holding hands and smiling at the camera. On the wall behind them, visible in the photograph, was the original family portrait from that transformative day 18 years earlier, because that's what real legacy looks like. Not the preservation of what was, but the courage to imagine what could be. And sometimes, it takes a child's question to help adults remember that the most important family traditions aren't about maintaining boundaries, but about expanding possibilities. The Martinez Blackwood story continues. One conversation, one family, one act of courage at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.